Thank you for coming out to the Debating Teacher Education, Critical Foundations, and the Future of Teacher Education, especially at the end of a busy workday and toward the end of a long work week. My name is Vichat Chuan. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Minnesota, and I'll be serving as moderator and timekeeper for the day. For those on Twitter, the hashtag for the debate is UMN Teacher Prep, and the debate is being recorded, and also the debate is being streamed live on Facebook. So for those who people have been asking, if you go to the Department of Curriculum and Instruction Facebook page, it's being streamed live now. I want to begin by thanking the Teacher of Color Council for in the Department of Curriculum Instruction and the Department of Curriculum Instruction for sponsoring this debate. I also want to thank APARC, for this beautiful space. I also want to thank in particular good people for their labor. David Melendez, who raised your hand, David, Kong, Peter, Diana, who's not here, Miranda, Brad, for setting things up and getting us comfortable for what I think is going to be an informative and enjoyable debate. So the debate comes out of many conversations between a number of us on campus, and some of these folks are in the room right now. And a lot of these conversations were really about asking questions over the years concerning what teacher education ought to look like. Not just here at the University of Minnesota, but in general, teacher education as a practice, as an intellectual and moral enterprise. And so these questions feel as important now as they've ever been, given current political and cultural moments. The past couple of years, in particular, there have been discussion about what conceptual framework should undergird our teacher preparation programs. In other words, what's the theory that should guide our practice in this critical work? And today, we have a structured debate. Debates are important because they help to illuminate important differences in thought, for us, differences in the practice of teaching and teacher education. And these differences matter for what kind of teachers we seek to prepare to work with our young people in our schools. Debates are important because they offer audiences like us the chance to make sense of arguments and consider the construction of these logical conclusions. And for our debaters, the chance to hear each other's arguments and to respond in the moment. Each of our debaters today is a person of beautiful intellect and a person with passion for education and justice. I'd like to introduce each speaker, beginning with Professor Zach Casey. Dr. Casey is an assistant professor of educational studies in the Department of Psychology at Rhodes College in Tennessee. His work focuses on building critical literacy in anti-racist pedagogies with practicing and future teachers, as well as the social, cultural, and philosophical context of education. Dr. Casey recently published a book, A Pedagogy of Anti-Capitalist Anti-Racism, Whiteness, Neoliberalism, and Resistance in Education, by SUNY Press. And his other writing appears in places like the Harvard Educational Review and the Journal of Curriculum Theorizing. Please join me in welcoming Professor Casey to the debate. The second speaker, he's over there, is Professor Mohammed Khalifa, who is the Robert H. Beck Professor of Ideas in Education in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy and Development at the University of Minnesota. Professor Khalifa is a preeminent scholar of educational leadership whose research examines how school leaders enact culturally responsive leadership practices. His work has appeared in a number of leading journals and is the co-editor of 3 major books, including the Handbook of Urban Educational Leadership, Becoming Critical, The Emergence of Social Justice Scholars, and The School to Prison Pipeline, The Role of Culture and Discipline in Schools. His 4th and most recent book, due out later this spring, is entitled Culturally Responsive School Leadership and is being published by Harvard Educational Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Khalifa. Our final speaker is Dr. Nina Asher, Professor of Culture and Teaching in the Department of Curriculum Instruction at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on post-colonial and feminist theory and globalization. Professor Asher is a leading scholar on post-colonial theory in education and has published extensively in the field. Her work has appeared in many places, including Qualitative Studies in Education, Teachers College Record, Curriculum Inquiry, and Educational Researcher. Just on a personal note, her article, Dr. Asher's article in Educational Researcher years ago, entitled Made in the Multicultural, in parentheses, USA, Unpacking Tensions of Race, Culture, Gender, and Sexuality in Education, was for me a wonderful introduction to her broader range of thinking when I was a newer scholar. And I believe this piece remains one of the journal's most cited articles since its publication. Please join me in welcoming Professor Asher. The structure of the debate will be as such. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to present their position. Afterwards, each speaker will have 4 minutes to respond. Then we'll open it up to a little more back and forth with audience questions. Please see the note cards that you've been handed. You can write your questions on those note cards and hand them to either Ezekiel. Ezekiel, raise your hand. Okay. Or Annie. And we'll use those to engage our speakers. The debate will conclude with 2 minutes of final remarks from each speaker. That's our plan for today. And so let's begin. First up will be Professor Casey.
Well, thanks, y'all. It's a really special moment for me to be back here. I finished my PhD here 5 years ago this spring, so to be back with you all feels oh yeah, cheers. But to be back with you all feels really great. I've been asked to prepare remarks and to represent a perspective of an orthodox Marxian critical pedagogy as applied to teacher education. So just to really jump in on the deep end here, my thesis would be the following from that perspective. The aim of teacher education must be conscientizing for revolutionary transformation. That includes abolishing the nation state and all political borders, the end of private property, and a global project of humanization. We can best understand a Marxist approach to teacher education from the work, I would argue, of Paulo Freire. Freire actually has one singular word for conscientizing for revolutionary transformation, that's conscientiação. He defines that in the introduction to Pedagogy of the Oppressed as follows. The term conscientiação refers to learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. This then is the task for teachers. That makes it our mission as teacher educators. And just going back into that quote, right? What this means we're after is learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions. Those are ways of orienting a curriculum. Those are ways of using or mobilizing academic disciplines as a way of focusing that work. So let's talk about some of those contradictions quickly. First, we have to start with the Marxian concept of the labor theory of value. That is, as quickly as I can go through, that's still intelligible. I'm thinking about the distance and the difference between what something costs and the compensation for producing it. All right. For Marxists, this is the source of value. This is the source of profit, right? And we're going to talk about that as a surplus labor value. That is the difference between what I pay a worker and what I actually make when I sell said goods. All right. This is the source of profit still in late or neoliberal capitalism, depending on what terminology you want to give that. Let's talk about how that works, right? So since the 1980s, we've been experiencing what we call wage deflation. That is, adjusted for inflation, wages are actually fixed, if not dropping. Part of what that looks like is outsourcing and offshoring, but also part of what that looks like is financialization. For instance, the conversion from pensions to 401ks, for instance, right? Now 401ks, mortgages, right? Mortgage-backed securities, these different kinds of financial instruments are the primary source of corporate profit. About 88% of corporate profit since the year 2000 has been from the financial sector and from financial products, okay? That's financialization. That's a form of redistribution. And that's also what we've been experiencing, is a massive redistribution to the wealthiest in this country. All right, roll into that neoliberal privatization. That is the conversion of hereto public goods and spaces being made private. Once they're made private, now that it's possible to receive rent, now it's possible to break them up, sell them at a profit, so on and so forth. All right, these are the contradictions of capitalism that Freire is talking about and calling our attention to. Okay, and maybe further, right? This is where Freire is going to talk about academic subjects and their worth, right? English for the sake of English, math for the sake of math is empty, right? We have to have a direction. We have to have a focus. That is realizing and working to respond, not only to understand, but to respond to these contradictions. So a focus on only a portion of our social totality, and you know, so, I mean, a couple people laughed when I started, right? This is as big as it gets. But I'm going to argue a focus on only a portion of our social totality functions as what Freire called sectarianism. He makes clear many on the left can and have fallen into sectarian positions, right? Sometimes this gets talked about as the schizophrenic left. Sign my petition to free the whales, sign my petition to protect a woman's right to her own body. Over here, let's talk about nuclear weapons. Over here, let's talk about disarmament, so on and so forth. What is it that holds all of these actions and moments together, right? That's what Freire is warning us about in terms of falling into sectarianisms. So then any perspective that does not center the abolition of capitalism is in opposition to a full humanization. Let's think about justice, for instance. There cannot be justice within capitalism. Fundamentally, by definition, capitalism necessitates injustice, right? So recent fetish for restorative justice, for instance, I'm bewildered by that concept. Restoring, that's backwards facing, right? That's something that I'm going to retrieve from the oppressive past and then present it forward within a capitalist superstructure. What justice? Okay. So capitalism uses other oppressions instrumentally. That is, it makes them tools or technologies. All right, here just as a couple for instances, and a way that this works too, we use capitalism as a barometer for other forms of oppression. Think about the wealth gap when we talk about white supremacy, right? As empirical evidence of white supremacy, the black and white wealth gap. As empirical evidence for patriarchy, we would cite the wage gap between men and women, right? 79 cents, 80 cents on the dollar. These are ways that actually naturalize and reify capitalism. Capitalism is this way of measuring, right? We're measuring injustice within a fundamentally unjust system. Right? Rarely do we take those stats as endemic, right, or as indicative of that totalizing capacity of the oppression of capitalism. All right? And so without centering anti-capitalism, we are only ever talking about realigning the same constellations of oppression, right? Some of these no excuses charters, everybody's going to go to college. It says, if we want young black men to all become hedge fund managers, create the same sorts of redlining policies that disenfranchise entire communities and so forth, right? Okay. So, thinking about colonialism, right? Colonialism always was an economic project. It's a fundamentally economic project. It's a form of accumulation by dispossession, to use the Marxian terminology from Harvey. All right. And so just to wrap up, because I think I'm getting close, right? So then focusing on identity should actually function to cultivate a shared sense of proletarian subjectivity. Fetishizing difference is akin to playing into the divisive logics of false scarcity that aim to prevent broader solidarities. In our emphasis around multicultural education and hyper-focused identities, we lose the pieces that are actually meant to be pulled together in order to articulate a full and responsive agenda that's in opposition. That is, to actually collectivize, to literally unite the workers of the world. That has to be the mission and focus of teacher education.
Next
Next up will be Professor Khalifa.
Good evening. Many thanks to Professor Chung for organizing and hosting this debate, Timothy Linsmeyer also for co-organizing. Professor Asher, you have been one of the colleagues who I hold in very high regard. I've been reading your works for years, especially the ER article, and one of the few people that I think bring issues of coloniality into focus with racial issues here in the U.S. Professor Casey, though I haven't met you before, you're one of the country's preeminent anti-capitalist scholars who also engages anti-racism work. So I have tremendous hope for the work ahead that you'll bring us. So many thanks to you two for sharing the stage. In the debate, I'm representing a position that race and anti-racism be front and centered in discussions of teacher education and educational reform. And it should be also central in discussions of educational leadership, teacher leadership, educational psychology, and other subdisciplines in education. I contend that race must be centered, not only because most educators run from the topic of race and have all sorts of ways of refocusing the conversation away from race on themselves, on socioeconomic status or fragility or how their grandfathers made it despite being a white immigrant. We need to and so many more tactics of avoidance. We need to kind of visibilize and decenter whiteness in U.S. education regardless of all of these things. But let me be clear from the outset. Race is a conduit through which capitalism and coloniality happen in the United States context. Understanding capitalism is crucial to understanding how schools are shaped today, but capitalist structures were and continue to be deeply reliant on dispossession of indigenous land and epistemology and the subjugation and disposability of black bodies and appropriation of black genius. Earlier, this of course happened through policies of slavery and manifest destiny, which are again inextricably linked to race. But later this happened vis-a-vis Jim Crow, residential segregation, deindustrialization, and the rapid expansion of the working poor, which directly led to the overrepresentation of black and brown Americans in US prisons. All of these policies were predicated on anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, and white supremacy. Similarly, post-colonial theory is not only powerful, but a necessary way to understand how education occurs. Indeed, in my view, white Western European colonialism is the most destructive system of oppression that humanity has ever witnessed. But let us not forget that, according to Ramon Grosfoguel and Walter Mignolo and other post-colonial scholars, that it was the conquest of El-Andalus, and in particular the system of forced slave labor of African Moors through a system of encomienda that would be used to conquer these U.S. lands in the entire world. And in fact, according to Professor Grosfoguel, it was the first time in humanity, the first time that in world history, where you have an organizing principle of a political economy, which is based on this principle, people with a soul versus people without a soul. And this would later be extended to blacks and non-blacks. As my final introductory point, I point out that race intersects and in this context explains capitalism and coloniality. In other words, one could have conversations about white supremacy, which is a set of ideas that could either be socio-political, tangible, interpersonal, but what Charles Mills defines as a political system, a particular power structure with formal and informal rules, socioeconomic privilege and norms from the differential distribution of material wealth and opportunities, benefits and burdens, rights and duties. One could discuss this without deep discussions of capitalism or coloniality. But the context of education in the US, it is impossible to talk about capitalism, post-colonialism, coloniality without having deep conversations about race. So then you might be wondering, what exactly does race have, or anti-racism, have to do with education, and what should we know about it? This also requires just a bit of background. Education, so I'm still in the intro. Education was used as a weapon against black and indigenous people. Europeans were not content with racialized bodies in indigenous lands, so they enacted and continued to act a type of epistemic violence or epistemicide, depending on who is describing this act, against these people. That is, they seek to kind of destroy their very sense of being. So ways of knowing, black and indigenous people, how they see themselves, how they process the world, how they understand and convey knowledge, their relationship to each other, the land, to a higher power, to communities. And if that was not all, to destroy and erase all of this as they entered our schools. Then, as black and indigenous people, we were rendered intellectually invalid our epistemologies, their knowledge was inferiorized and thus not allowed in schools. And after Black and Indigenous people were actually allowed in schools, those schools became places of hostility that invalidated who they were as people, as General Pratt famously said, kill the Indian and save the man. And this happened, of course, vis-a-vis schools. So because of this history of violence, it's no wonder why schools and other types of governmentality have been culpable in the educational affairs of some communities and what they face. W.E.B. Du Bois put it this way in his 1935 article, Does the Negro Need Separate Schools? He writes, if this is true, and if we recognize the present attitude of white America toward Black America, then the Negro not only needs the vast majority of these schools, but it is a grave question if in the near future he will not need more such schools, both to take care of his natural increase and to defend him against the growing animosity of whites. Now, there's so much we can deconstruct from what Du Bois has written here, but let me focus on the animosity of whites that Du Bois has referenced. This epistemic violence would not be the only problem. In fact, schools were deeply interwoven with notions of racial inferiority and superiority. So for Blacks who were viewed as subhuman, it was a biological description, and I'll quote someone from that in a minute. But for Indigenous people, they were savages who, since they were people with souls, they could actually be corrected, they could be desavagized. As grotesque and oppressive as these notions were, I see the current problem in teacher education as this. This oppressive history has been invisibilized to most teachers and school leaders. Here's a quote from Bill Watkins, historian. In 1935, Carlos Linnaeus, the acclaimed biological taxonomist, was among the first to classify human beings by race. He used both skin color and personal characteristics for his typology. His essay, Systeme Notaria, divided people into black, white, red, and yellow. He found whites to be innovative and often keen in mind, while blacks were lazy and careless. The notion that races exhibited different mental and moral traits became a central part of the new discourse, which was later invisibilized. That is an addition for me. Indeed, schools can only be judged by those who are least served. Centering and discussing notions of invisibilized racial history is one way to do that. How classrooms are managed, how knowledge is conveyed, who is considered a good student, whose communities are good, what counts as learning, and when it happens, who is disruptive, and who therefore needs to be removed, are all questions that if asked, many teachers and principals will likely give you solid answers. Hardly any of them realize how these answers are deeply connected to their own racial histories and socialization about how they view people of color. Race is the proxy or conduit by which oppression has happened in schools. Now our students are, of course, oppressed by their gender, socioeconomic status, their mother language group, sexual orientation, and other minoritizing characteristics. We can help them most by and through an engagement of race, because oppression happens to racial minoritized students first in this context. It always happens to them. It happens to them most widely, most severely. It happens to them despite the fact that federal, state, and local policies are constantly drafted to prevent it. And it happened to them because America happened, and America only happened because of the oppression of their communities. And it spilled into all other aspects of life. On this, there's a question also of humanity of whites. I have one question. If you were to commit a heinous crime such as rape or murder or emotional abuse, what would that make you? What does that say about your humanity? Are you in touch with the key attributes that makes a person be or a suitably human being? And if it is true that these things are subhumanizing, then how about the constant and persistent oppression of minoritized students? So discussions of race allow teachers to understand and recognize their own humanity and to begin to answer questions about their humanity or lack thereof. And finally, race allows for one other key point: indigenous epistemologies and imaginations that are necessary for humanity in schools. In other words, if we're brave enough to actually seek and identify the agencies, the imaginations, the epistemologies, the rich cultural knowledges of racial minorities and center them in schools, we can begin to reform schools. This has been done in New Zealand and other places. Okay. One more sentence. And this will be, this will lead to humanization, dignity, and racial minoritized students and their communities, their epistemologies, and while not the focus, even the educators and leaders that serve them. Our schools must center pro-Blackness, indigeneity, and other indigenous epistemologies in order for humanity to remain in schools. Thank you.
this is a tough act to follow. I think I'll need about 60 seconds and then can you all hear me? Is this catching? Yeah. And I can sit down because Zach and Mohammed have done just such a tremendous job. Let me see if I have anything else that I can share. And Vicha, thank you too for the kind and generous introduction. So I thank my colleagues, Vicha Chon and Tim Lensmeyer, for inviting me earlier this week to join in today's conversation. My presentation is titled Engaging Postcolonialism and the Future of Teacher Education. And I prepared this week, and it's organized in 2 sections. So section 1, what is postcolonialism? How is it relevant to teacher education? Postcolonial thought, postcolonial theory, and analyses emerge from a critique of colonialism and its effects or aftermath. Scholars in the humanities and social sciences have written about identity, culture, and language, nation and empire, the effects of and resistance to colonization, as well as the challenges and possibilities of decolonization, of extricating oneself from the colonizing frame or situation, given the post-colonial predicament of being implicated in the very structures that one is attempting to dismantle. Not surprisingly, many post-colonialists are, like me, scholars of color, at least in US parlance, often with connections to former colonies, occupied lands, and marginalized communities. Some of the key themes from post-colonial thought that have informed my own work in teacher education for 2.5 decades include engaging 1, the ambivalent intertwined relationship of the colonized and the colonizer; 2, the inherent contradictions of such, witness for instance Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks; and 3, the interstices, to borrow on Homi Bhabha's term, the in-between spaces as potential sites of transformation. Post-colonial feminist thought further enhances the integrity of this work by centering self-reflexivity and the engagement of intellect and affect and spirit towards transformation. Witness, for instance, Gloria Anzaldua's Mestiza, or Trin Minha's Woman of Color Writer, and Bell Hooks's notion of home place as a site of resistance. Post-colonialism acknowledges that, 1, identities and cultures are not static. They are dynamic and constituted by processes that unfold at the intersections of race, class, culture, gender, and nation. Identities, cultures, and locations are not monolithic. For instance, the global South is present in the global North, and vice versa. Bichet was kind enough to mention my Ed Researcher piece. I won't repeat the title then. In that piece, though, one of the things I noted, this was 11 years ago, the self, regardless of its location, is never exempt. Even those of us who may see ourselves as multiculturally open or progressive or liberal and so on, need to confront squarely our own assumptions and the limits of our own vision. Post-colonial thought interrogates the intertwining of colonized and colonizer and pushes beyond such binaries as here and there, of color and white. Now, this assertion may set up a jangling about the dangers of slipping into a seemingly benign cultural relativism, and it should. Let me elaborate. With a rigorous and critical self-reflexive post-colonial frame, within a rigorous and critical self-reflexive post-colonial frame, this troubling of binary constructions does not preclude or eclipse specificities. Rather, post-colonial educators and researchers acknowledge context-specific, material, structural, and historical forces and effects of colonization and colonialism, even as they acknowledge and examine the ways in which the colonized internalize the colonizer. They continue to work towards decolonization in post-colonial contexts and wrestle with their own implicatedness. Post-colonialism and decolonization coexist. The past and the present inform each other and the future. Such work is critical for the future of teacher education in an increasingly interdependent, hyper-digitized world shaped by the spread of neoliberal capitalism, where the multicultural and the global inevitably meet in the daily life of the classroom. Indeed, post-colonial thought has allowed me to work with contradictions as well as both commonalities and differences across individuals, communities, and contexts. One brief example from my work. I brought post-colonial theory, specifically the concept of interstices and mestiza locations, cultures, identities, to inform the development of my multicultural education pedagogy as I taught core courses in undergraduate and master's teacher education programs in the Deep South. I was at LSU for 12 years before I came to this university. The majority of the students in these courses were young white women, which is typical in terms of demographics of elementary education programs in the US at this time, right? So in my 2005 article, Teachers College Record, where I developed this work, I also drew on and integrated Alice Walker's civil rights era novel, Meridian, which is set in the South. The insights this novel offered allowed me to self-reflexively deepen my own knowledge and understanding of the Deep South as a teacher educator. Concluding thoughts. Working across borders is not new. Gandhi, working in India, South Africa, and England, corresponded with Tolstoy in Russia in colonial and czarist times about nonviolence, global politics, and peace. This was my term for today, BT, or before television. Gay African-American poet Langston Hughes wrote the poem Gandhi is Fasting, speaking to the similarities between British colonial rule in India and Jim Crow laws in the US South. This too was BT. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, a principal architect of the Indian Constitution and the first law minister of independent India, was a Dalit. That is, he came from a caste community that were known as untouchables and suffered great discrimination. Ambedkar studied social sciences at Columbia University in New York City. This too was BT. Later, MLK Jr. drew on Gandhi's civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance work in India to inform his thought and work on civil rights here in the USA. In the 1980s, in Margaret Thatcher's England, Pakistani-British filmmaker and writer Hanif Qureshi found solace and inspiration in the writings of gay African-American essayist James Baldwin as he was working on My Beautiful Laundrette, a film revolving around an interracial gay love story. When I first began working on education projects designed to improve educational opportunities for students from marginalized urban and rural communities, this was over 3 decades ago in India, my then supervisor was using Brazilian educator Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed to inform our work. All of this was before the internet era. Working across differences of identity, culture, and location is not new. Again, the past and the present inform each other and the future. John Lennon gave us Imagine. Maya Lin, who designed the Vietnam War Memorial, has given us her stunning interactive global digital project, What is Missing, which invites individual stories and memories of nature, environmental loss, and extinction as a global memorial to the planet and as a way to protect nature and reimagine our relationship to the natural world. And Marvel Studios have given us Wakanda. Post-colonial and feminist thought then remains my source of vibranium that allows me to engage ever-evolving multiplicities of identity and culture present in every classroom in recursive, non-essentializing ways. It allows me to look for stories and approaches that are lost, buried, unthought, missing, in order to imagine anew, day after day, year after year, a future in which teacher education may actually be recognized as central to our shared human endeavor and future.
Thank you. So at this point, each speaker will have 4 minutes of response or rebuttal. And we'll start with Professor Casey. All right.
I'm left thinking about differences between subjectivity and identity. When I'm thinking about identity, I'm thinking about the wealth of cultural productions that we've cited here, right, and that we've mobilized from going backward from Wakanda on down to BT and so forth. I want to make the case that proletarian subjectivity is not an identity. Proletarian is materially produced. That is, it is a subjectivity that is produced by a system, a totalizing global system of meanings, of productions that absolutely has superstructural and cultural elements to it, aspects to it, runoffs to it, determinants that flow and follow it. However, proletarian subjectivity is not an identity, and it actually gets us away from many identitarian claims and this kind of identitarian sectarianism. Okay, I'm thinking about in response to this question of the way in which we ought to measure our social systems and our engagement is with those who are the least served. I think we are really good at identifying the least served. I think there's a lot of critical energy and intellect that goes into the ways that we're going to measure the least served. That fetish for measurement, that a desire to know just how deep that well goes, just how dehumanizing, horrible, and oppressive is it for this group. Let's compare that to this group. Let's get one more because we like threes in academia. This kind of process, this kind of project, I'm going to argue is a form of false consciousness that distracts from larger movement building. It becomes a kind of oppression Olympics. Okay. I was also struck by the mention of Black Panther. Who is making money from Black Panther? Really, where is it going? This is another form of redistribution. This is a way of specifically targeting working class, disproportionately communities of color, and having that money flow back into the wealthiest pockets imaginable. The various kinds of cultural gains that can be possible from seeing action heroes that look like you can function as well to persuade us to actually coalesce to the neoliberal hegemony that we find ourselves surrounded in. All right, and I'm struck by this because I think as a cultural production, it is critically significant and really worth paying attention to. And simultaneously, I want us to be on guard for those moments that are so culturally seductive that they get us away from that proletarian subjectivity and capacity building. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Professor Khalifa, your response?
I'll also make mine quite a bit short. Oppression Olympics, I like that. However, I have to start by saying that both neoliberalism as well as capitalism and capitalist structures need ways to express themselves. And it would be easy for someone who is not from a culturally minoritized group to make that reference of it's this group versus that group. But when you see individuals and you see families and you see communities uprooted and hurt, then we have to have some sort of recognition of people who are living in those experiences. However, I did end, and I think that I'd like to cite Christine Sleater's work, who did a lot of work in New Zealand, with saying that we need some sort of way in schools in order to tap into ways that we can as that minoritized people who are consistently oppressed by every measure, not just sort of like the neoliberal measures, but by every measure, including their own voices and community expressions of that. But they also have this agency, and so I would like to kind of refocus. I would like to point out that both of my opponents and colleagues on the stage are missing that. They're focusing on how oppression continues, and that is something that will not serve the best interest of students who are underserved in this context. We have to, at some point, find the radical imaginations. We have to, at some point, find those borders. You did refer to some of the to Baba's work, and so White would call it the middle ground. We have to find expressions that these people can live with dignity, honor, and to remain in a critical space of critiquing systems of we have to do that, indeed, but to remain there is costly for those people on whom we are up on the stage speaking. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Asher, your response?
Well, it's a bit, I think, hard to respond with so much jangling, and now I'm like, I want to respond to the responses too, right? and very frankly, since we are all talking one way or the other about materialities, I'm thinking, how much more debate is going to solve any problem? Enough debate, you know. But that said, I first want to actually, because I think Vichet, you did say we could actually do both, like respond and have push the conversation further. And I thought, you know, I felt grateful to be on a panel where all panelists are acknowledging some of the dangers of capitalism. All panelists are acknowledging from their different locations the dangers of systemic oppressions. I think all of us realize that however hard we try right now, and we should continue to try, we are not going to be able to resolve all of it. So with recognizing in our various and particular ways, the ways in which there's limits to our efforts, not that therefore we shouldn't try, as you said, Mohammed, too, just now, one should continue to make these efforts. What I would say too, though, is that there really is an enormous, enormous danger of ignoring one's own privilege. And I don't just mean, I do mean race privilege, but not only race. I mean race, gender, socioeconomic status. One of the things of which I feel extremely aware, that even if as a queer woman of color, so on and so forth, naturalized citizen, all of those, I stand to gain by middle class status, right? I stand to gain by the fact that I can afford to buy clothes that are being manufactured where somebody else is being paid a pittance, right? Right? So really, I think it's very convenient sometimes for all of us, and when I say all of us, I don't exclude myself, right, to articulate critique. Because the other side, I was thinking too of, just like Wakanda, like Slumdog Millionaire, there was a lot of critique and outrage when that film brought the slums of Bombay into on the big screen and made big bucks. The same critiques were articulated, and yet at the same time, something else also happened, you know, which is where I find Homi Bhabha useful, which is where I find Gloria Anzaldúa useful, right? Homi Bhabha has been critiqued. As if anybody has read Location of Culture, my students in classes, when I always say, I still use a dictionary when I sit with that work. Yeah, tenubrious, wow, what a juicy word, tenubrious, you know. But yeah, it's a wonderful word, really. But anyway, there you go. So but the thing is, he says that, you know, even if a particular encounter goes away, it leaves a resistant trace. And it's these resistant traces, when Bell Hooks talks in her Home Place piece about how women created the home place as a site of resistance, where there was dignity in the midst of oppression. So let's not delve into convenient, like monolithic arguments, right? So those are some of the things to which I know I return, continue to return, and need to be reminded sometimes 30 years and counting. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. This is the part of the debate in which we're going to open things up. Yes, if you have any written questions on your cards, please hand them over to Annie. I'm going to start with a question, and then I'm going to ask an audience questions. Then I want to invite the speakers to engage each other a little bit. I suppose to kind of pick up where you left, Nina, to move things forward, there are three kind of distinct perspectives on the stage right here, and there were some other perspectives, like, for example, a person taking the position of a kind of like grounding a teacher prep program in more multiculturalism, right? Which we have those, right? Or even culturally relevant pedagogy, which are strong elements of that are within our program here and programs elsewhere. But those perspectives are not represented in some ways because they do have the mic, right? They do have a platform in mainstream programs. And so that was part of the purpose. And I guess I really want you to push in pushing forward. I really want you to we can't have everything though, you know? And I wonder if, and that's a personal opinion now. that you can't do everything because you'll end up not doing a whole lot. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that from the position of the perspectives that you've been arguing for.
Stick with the formula. I go first, right? So, I can't do everything. What I'm thinking about is, okay, transforming the conditions of capitalism, transforming private property. What does that actually do about heteropatriarchy? Right? What does it actually change? To me, I think a Marxian response to that is, I don't think we can actually articulate. We are so enmeshed in capitalism as a system that, again, we conflate just about all forms of oppression not with capitalism or as this other sort of totalizing force, right? This is actually, I think, part of why if you don't have a strong Marxist orientation when you encounter Freire's work, there's a way to read oppressors and oppressed not actually as stand-ins for bourgeoisie and proletarian, right? Not as stand-ins for the owners of the means of production, right? Particularly when I read this with white students, we have lots of conversations about, wait, am I the oppressor? But hang on, like 2 days ago I was the oppressed, but not, right? And these kinds of faulty schisms, right? And so what I would encourage, right, is maybe in recognition of the fact that focusing on a particular form of oppression will always come with trade-offs, right? Will always mean, I'm thinking of Kumashiro's work on this point, right? Any attention focused on a particular issue or area is simultaneously a lack of attention paid elsewhere. I don't want to advocate then for, again, to go back to oppression, so what, how do you pick, right? Let's like flip a coin, or we need a multi-sided coin to decide. The argument that I want to keep coming back to is those pieces that are materially produced that I can actually understand these fundamental social relationships as they would be transformed. That is, heteronormativity, just to go back to that, right, would be utterly transformed were private property not at stake, not always in play in the reasons and conditions for that particular form of oppression. White supremacy, likewise, right, would be transformed with the absence of private property. And I'm not saying that it makes it go away, right? There's not necessarily that automaticity to it. To be really flippant and provocative, some people are assholes, but a position like this would actually get us to a position, right, where white supremacy actually takes on that level of entanglement, right? Not determining life chances, not determining life outcomes, not determining health outcomes, not determining housing outcomes, schooling outcomes. We could keep going. And so that's that kind of what I think a Marxian perspective here actually offers us, is a way, yes, to acknowledge we're not focusing on the all, but we have an articulated and sophisticated reason for what we're going to prioritize, how we're actually going to think about this solidarity building, and a wealth of resources to do that work. That's where I go.
Well, is it okay if we sit? I'll move a little closer. So how, in these capitalist structures, who is it that remains the oppressed in most cases? So let's go back a little bit. So obviously America would not be a thing if it were not for the disposability, the enslavement, the disposability of black bodies, and the dispossession of Indian land. We mentioned that. Now, throughout history, however, black folks and indigenous folks in this country have resisted, and they have built some of these spaces that we've been kind of discussing. So I'll talk about Detroit a little bit. Detroit, we had something that rivaled Harlem. We had Black Bottom, we had Paradise Valley, we had 30-something black-owned hospitals, we had almost 20 black-owned banks. Despite the fact that redlining happened, despite the fact that all of these capitalist things happened, we still, as Detroiters, built resistance to that, only for white supremacy to rear its ugly head again, come in, crime-ridden areas, and destroy everything that we've built. And if you go to Charlotte and the Brooklyn neighborhood, and if you, almost any city you go to, when black folks actually did come up with capitalistic responses, it wasn't capitalism, because that didn't happen to the white folks. And in schools, whites, Irish, and Italians and Jews have been able to transcend some of the things that you're talking about, but not blacks, right? And so I think that we have to be very cognizant of how coloniality and capitalism happen in this context. So and the only way to do that is to recognize and to engage race. And so I'll leave it there.
My turn. And I think the gist of the question for us at this point was, one can't do everything, right?
Just your thoughts on,
Yeah,
on
right.
That,
That
on that position.
yeah. I mean, yeah. One is taking in so much that I want to be sure that I'm not misremembering it. So where I went was kind of even just my own journey. I distinctly remember as a graduate student in New York City, a new international graduate student who had never left India before coming to go to grad school, right? So I felt disconnected with grad school in my first year or two or whatever. And I mentioned working in India on various projects, etc. And that was after a degree in social work. And I ended up working with like a South Asian newly formed women's group in Manhattan for a little bit because I wasn't sure which route. And I hear students even now struggling, is the academy for me or isn't it? So in terms of thinking about sticking with one or two things that one can do and do them well. It took me a little while, 30 years or close to 30 years ago. And I really began, once I had the aha moments and knew what I wanted to work with and stumbled across Homi Bhabha's work. And I'm like, oh my God, this speaks to my dissertation, you know. But all of this is to say, then the ways in which one finds ways of grounding one's work, one finds ways of pushing across binaries, right? One of the great joys of working within the American university context is that we really get we have great opportunities. I don't mean, it's not to do with money. I mean, yes, everything is driven by capitalism, but it is to do, no, but in terms of really good students, really motivated students, and the range of diversity. I just find that word so troubling these days, right? It's become such a commodity. But the range of diversity of thought, right, that is afforded us. And students who are basically, and several of them are here and I'm thrilled. So students who are basically going to be doing this in the next 20, 30 years, right? So to get a chance actually to do work that way is where I decided to put in my time and thought and energy, and then I volunteer where I can. But it became clear to me 30 years ago, I'm not going to be somebody who can organize marches, although I want to organize marches to bring down capitalism. I do. But that's not my forte, right? So I brought the question very much to a ground level here. But really, for me, then it informs all the other work I do, you know. Do we need to use them for recording purposes, or can we just bellow without? Okay.
In collecting some questions from the audience, I've organized. I'm gonna share three in particular all at once because I feel like there's some connection amongst them, and I'll give it to you, and then we're gonna open it up for you to ask each other questions. The first question. These are all good questions, by the way. So it's not. This is the part about making choices, right? The first question is, what are some ways that teacher education programs can decenter whiteness in their curriculum? And the person wrote that in particular for Dr. Khalifa. Okay. The second question is, how does or can early childhood education, both the young children and the current as well, and future teachers in teacher ed programs, play a role in making the changes that you're all sort of arguing for? So it's a question about early childhood education. And the third question is, in speaking to the the necessary concepts of transformation and radical imagination. Have you seen these? Have you seen these things in practice, enacted in practice? And can you talk about those times when you've seen them? So.
Well, since Vijay handed the mic, I will respond. The students who have taken classes with me know what I'm about to say. The short answer is yes. So the short answer to the questions is yes. But taking this further then, radical imagination in practice. Creativity, creative works, legends, stories exist. It's the human impulse to create, right? It's how we choose to see and center and draw on and make central to our work in teacher ed programs, in curricula, right? Whether it's in K-12 context, right? Instead of that being like an add-on, right? I cited Langston Hughes' poem Gandhi is Fasting. It's an amazing, it gives me goosebumps every time I read it. But he's talking about people being beaten by the British, let me use the active voice, British soldiers beating Indian people in India, just the way we are Jim Crowed by white folks here, he says, And I think to myself, why cannot we do more such work where we say, hello, this was like, Hughes is writing this in the 1930s, never having been to India. What allowed him to see deeply, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say? So if I were to center as a teacher, I don't care whether it's early childhood, old childhood, whatever it is, at whatever level, right? Yeah, at whatever level, one can always center the power of that kind of seeing deeply, the power of that kind of contemplative work, and the power of breaking down that contemplation means, inaction. It doesn't have to mean inaction, right? That's what Thich Nhat Hanh has talked about too, right? So those are some of the ways in which I know I work on these issues, and one can see it happening in not good sounds weird, but in classrooms where there's a creative energy with students and teachers who actually are creative. And it doesn't necessarily have to do, sadly it becomes that way, but it doesn't have to do with material wealth either. This kind of creative work does happen in so many places. And one of the sources I had kind of, in grayscale in my paper, but several students, we've talked about Rethinking Schools, the publisher out of Milwaukee, and many of their works, and their practitioner-based works. And it's not that they are not problematic. There are critiques one can raise with those works, but there's that kind of work happening too. So even as we are critiquing, how may we fulfill the responsibility of actually centering more such work? That's one thought. So I'll pause here.
Okay, so I think I've got the questions. So ways to decenter whiteness, I'll start with that one. I don't think it's visible. So it's not possible to decenter whiteness without making it first visible and teaching it to students and about how whiteness operates and how it shifts and how it maintains hegemony and control. And another way I think to decenter whiteness, I think connects with the last question, which is to establish multiple indigenous paradigms and curriculums that would rather center education. Now, this has to be done with great care, because I've seen multiple instances in which, for example, some of our indigenous brothers and sisters have been detribalized in particular areas and have not been given. So if you come and say, okay, let's establish Navajo curriculum in this area, and and other indigenous people in the same area have been detribalized, then you run the risk of repeating oppression despite good intentions. So it has to be done with great care. I've seen the same here in Twin Cities with Somalis. I will go engage a school district, and whoever the first Somali person is that they hired in that particular district, they'll say, hey, we're engaging the Somali community, and I'm thinking, well, which one? and then only to find out that every other Somali in that district that was hired was from that person's subclan. So so these are not easy things to do, and they have to be done with great care. But I think nonetheless they can be done. So let me shift down to the third question, which was, have I seen examples of this? So that's a problematic question a little bit, because anytime examples of this have existed, because we do live in a capitalist society, and because of some of the strictures of white supremacy are upon us, I've seen things like that constantly challenged. They struggle with money. I've seen, in my own community, the Nation of Islam, they had hundreds of schools across the country, and that happened to them. And I've seen black schools in the South, which turned out some of the best black minds ever. So it's not like we haven't done it. And then only for Brown versus Board of Education to happen to that. And so I would point to Grace Lee Boggs' school in Detroit as an example that I was pleased with before I left. I haven't visited him in a few years. Also, Jeff Duncan Andrade's new school, Roses in the Concrete. I would encourage people to investigate and critique, because I think he's open to it. And then lastly, I'll say the Maori-centered education in New Zealand. I haven't visited myself, but to my understanding, they have incorporated Maori epistemologies throughout the entire way that education happens, not just the curriculum as an exoticized discussion of who the Maori are, but the way pedagogy happens, every discipline, everything. For the last question, or the middle question about early childhood education, I'll just say briefly that any reform you bring in, whether this or anything else, so I don't think North Europe is a good comparison to the United States of America, that has this deep history of racial oppression. Any reform you bring in, and even early childhood, despite all the data, obviously we all know about the study that happened last year in the early childhood classroom where they said watch the bad students, and the teachers are they had cameras aimed at the teacher eyes, and the eyes would just follow the black students around the classroom, right? So you all have heard of that story. So any reform you bring in, even if you say, let's put, I think it was Canada recently, yesterday, $2.2 billion to early childhood education, you have to have critical consciousness, white studies, indigenous studies along with that, or else it will fail, just like the others. Thank you.
I'll just be brief, because I want to affirm all of that. I'd add on the decentering whiteness question a materiality. So to decenter whiteness in education, we have to create more robust pathways for teachers of color to thrive and do the critical work they need to do. We need to do. Part of what that means for white people is getting out of the way, right? Stop being in the center if you want to decenter whiteness, right? The early childhood side, I think early childhood is actually a wash in communist thought. Think about the priorities of sharing. Right, sharing is one of the most foundational and fundamental aspects of those socialization pieces in early childhood. Right, so I think in lots of ways, right, the sort of communist consciousness is beaten out of us, right? But we have all kinds of evidence from early childhood of these different kinds of ways that solidarities are practiced, are expected, routinized, ritualized, embodied, right? And in terms of programs that teacher education programs that center Marxian perspectives more, for the most part, we have to look outside the United States, but we don't have to go far. So I'm thinking in particular of a number of different universities and non-university-based programs in Mexico, throughout Central and Southern America, or South America. And this will work against some of my decentering whiteness comments I just made, but I'm most familiar with McLaren's work there, and there's all kinds of resources there, lots of stuff on YouTube, lots of examples we can find.
Professor Casey, can I add something on to your decentering whiteness comments? So I think we have to be very careful too as educators when hiring teachers of color. First of all, I affirm everything you said, but we have to be careful that those teachers of color are also receiving the same type of critical pedagogy that white teachers do. Absolutely. Because they end up picking up and refining and reproducing the same type of systems that we're all talking about.
Absolutely.
So I invite each speakers just for maybe the next 10 minutes right now to kind of to pose questions to each other, and you can kind of so you may have picked up on this, and all week long I've been egging each speaker on to go after each other. Actually, just distorting and lying about things they've been saying. But and I confess that I've asked folks to kind of like take on these roles, and because these are really thoughtful people, and they have appreciation for other people's ideas, and I've asked them to suppress that appreciation for the sake of the event. And so maybe we can suspend that right now and kind of just have a conversation. So if you have some questions for each other.
Oh, well, one of the, oh, better? Sorry. Okay, thank you. Yeah, as someone who has not read Marx in the original except a little bit decades ago, one of the things with which and with any discourse, but with which I struggle, is how discourses get co-opted, and then we talk about how the academy too, it can become, if we let it, right? Like an exercise in peddling whatever is the newest, hottest theory or whatever, right? So situating myself as having limited knowledge of Marxist thought, my question is this. There have been over the decades critiques in terms of notions of gender and what is centered and so on. And so then if we are thinking through a race or post-colonial lens or all the different lenses here today, how could you help us think about that some more?
So I appreciate Vichet sort of removing the curtain. All right, so I'm a race scholar, right? So okay, here we go. Great question. All right, and I think I mean, mobilizing Marx is to mobilize 19th century Eurocentric logics. Marx is an absolute idiot when it comes to writing about South Asia. He misses all kinds of patriarchal and hypergendered elements of capitalism, of capitalist exploitation, of the particular ways in which women are re-marginalized within capitalist patriarchal systems. I think the sort of line that comes to mind for me, though, is bell hooks and teaching to transgress, right? When you're dying of thirst, you're not too proud to drink dirty water. You drink the water and spit the sand. I think that's what we have to do with these, particularly 19th century and even older epistemologies, right? The next thing we need to do is take a look at many of the scholars that have taken on those critiques and actually responded, right? So Marxist feminism is an entire field and discourse. I tend to use geography and critical geographies is probably the space academically that's happening the most in the United States. I really like Teresa Ebert's work that's coming out of this too in terms of these material productions. And what that looks like on a kind of more attention to culture. Even thinkers that are coming out of the Frankfurt tradition, right, are going to pay a lot more attention to cultural formations, to film, to cinema, to popular culture, and those kinds of spaces. Maybe the last move too. I think for us in education, if you were looking for like where should I jump in with Marx, I'd point you to the German ideology. He's much more worried about alienation. And I think it maps onto a lot more of that like embodied experience that so many of us have had in education. Of course, most of I think the tendency, right, is like, okay, the Communist Manifesto, and then that weirdly doesn't help much. And then Capital Volume 1, and we're kind of awash in 300 pages of the gold standard, and you're like, hang on, we got rid of that in the 70s. This isn't even useful anymore, right? So if you want to go full orthodox Marx, I'd recommend starting German ideology. But, yeah.
Professor Asher, how would you bring Homi Bhabha's work to Black folks in North Minneapolis?
Great question. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. That's a smashing question. So honestly, I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't, because yeah, no. So, but no, because I mean, come on, like how arrogant could one get, right? That said, though, where I find post-colonial thought really helpful to me is one of the other. I mean, I wouldn't just march up into North Minneapolis or North Baton Rouge or whatever and wave.
But how would you theorize about?
No, right. So right, but because there can be a danger of like trying to talk down or talking down without intending to talk down, and that's not what I'd want to do, right? That said, what I would do is if indeed there is, sometimes no theory is relevant, all you need is that water that you mentioned, right? Yeah, because that's not the time for theory. That said though, you know, bell hooks also wrote theory heals me. So in that sense, I do not see it at all as beyond anybody's reach, that, or in any situation that is, right? To actually talk about, okay, if, because there are factions within each and every group or community, which is why, once again, there ain't no monoliths, y'all. Okay, that's being recorded and I'll say it again, but there are no monoliths, right? So in that sense, if indeed one is, say, engaging issues of transformation, social change, of urban decline, any of those issues, right? Depending on what, where, whom, with a community organization, with students who might be doing an ethnography, whatever, project there, whichever way. I may actually want to leverage the notion of interstices or mestiza locations, anzalduas, in terms of thinking about how can we, even though we may, within this community, disagree around this and this way of actually making change happen, we have to take some steps somewhere. So in a very practical way, those are the ways in which I would bring those concepts. Did I kind of answer the question? Yeah, because it is this monolithic, I'm not saying that's what you would do, but any monolithic reading that really scares me. And that's the time I speak up. Yeah, one of the times I speak up, but yeah.
So a question for my comrade, Professor Khalifa. In your initial talk, you alluded to, and I'm wondering if you can say more about race first or anti-racist perspectives as a solidarity building movement, and how to think about the varied ways oppressions, privileges, microaggressions flare up even in the hashtag whatever of the moment kinds of spaces, right? I'm curious about sort of how do we push through? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, around these different kinds of ways that particularly white social actors embody privilege, bring that with them in ways that actually, within acting in solidarity, actually reinforces privilege and re-marginalizes folks.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good question. Well, I'll speak from. I've seen it happen so much. I've seen it happen, but I think most Black folks who have read this history and who know and who are aware of how these things have happened would also argue that those solidarities are needed. So it's sort of, so on the one hand, yes, there can be a reification, right, of privilege. It happened with Black Lives Matter. It consistently happens, right? Black Panthers, whatever example you would want to take, except with the Nation of Islam. And I'm not purporting that, but I think I think Minister Farrakhan's comments about Jewish people, about women, about gays, right, muffles some of the magic that actually came out of Garvey's movement and out of some of the early Black movements. That said, I would say that it's just a necessary in allyship. I mean, I always walk away. No disrespect to all of my white colleagues, but my allyships, I always walk away, I think, feeling less of a sense that I got something than I think that they may have gotten out of that, right? Because it's a constant performance of people of color whenever we're around white people. It's a constant negotiated existence that we've been socialized to do for quite some time. I'm speaking just from a personal space right now. And so but I like my white colleagues too. So it's like, so it's a constant negotiated kind of existence, which Black folks have always done since we've been here. So it's not a problem.
As you were talking, what popped into my head, I've been reading James Baldwin, right, lately. So, couple of things. One is, anytime one is part of a different culture, whatever the different culture is, I think it behooves one to just shut up and learn and read and listen, right? And even if I choose to be there, nobody needs me to be benign and kind and all that. Just do your homework, right? Yeah, so that's one. And so two is, Baldwin talking about how Bill Miller, who was a white female teacher, is the reason why he actually learned not to hate white people. And then Hanif Qureshi, 30 years down the road. So there's a power to the written word and Hanif Qureshi's film. So again, there come the interstices again, right? And there come solidarities that the kind of monolithic writing that, and maybe monolithic ain't the right word, y'all, but anyway, okay, I'm getting all folksy. It's time to wrap up. So, but yeah, right, happy hour. But no, so but the thing is this, that when in grad school, no, I really think this is a really important responsibility. When in grad school and all, we get passionate about theories, that and this. The thing though is doing the hard work of translating that theory into whatever work we are doing, project and context, in really meaningful ways. And that's where the richness comes up. And that's where, for me, like, the contradictions too. So it doesn't have to be that somebody who looks like this or who looks like that. One can bring it in terms of heterosexual, homosexual, queer, trans, bi. One may find the best allies who may not be like one, right? And yet there are spaces of openness, and it's exhausting forever to have to describe and explain that, right? Sure, yes. So how could one actually center these decentered energies, Anyway.
If we could end. If I'm going to ask the speakers to kind of end with some concluding remarks, some brief concluding remarks, and it could be a question for us to sort of leave with, because we do want the debate to continue after you leave here today. So if you we'll cap it at 2 minutes, but it doesn't have to be very long.
Sure. Part of the totalized context, reality present of capitalism can sometimes produce in us a desire to pretend like we could actually walk away from it, right? I'm gonna go into the woods, and I'm gonna be away and off the grid, and some of these pieces, right? I think the sort of hopefulness at the core of Marx's thought, right, is that capitalism has to fully express itself for its contradictions to reach the point where it is utterly untenable, utterly unfeasible, and there's no option but to build something else. Because there's so much, I'm thinking of Raymond Williams on determinisms here, right? So, it's not Marxist if there's no determinisms, but simultaneously, I think so often in discourses and contexts around anti-capitalism, it's so mystified, it's so big, it's way too big for individuated social actors, it's even too big for an entire nation to actually respond to, right? We have overwhelming empirical evidence of that. And so I would say the hope is actually still really central to Marxian perspectives, to anti-capitalist paradigms, and unless we leave thinking otherwise. So thanks for being here, y'all.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my esteemed professors are absolutely right. I don't disagree with anything that any of them have said. The question I think that I'm grappling with is, I feel ashamed to say that I don't think white supremacy or capitalism are anytime soon. I think that white people are violent. They're epistemically violent. They are physically and materially violent, and that's what I'm not talking about anybody in this room. I'm talking about historically, and it could be somebody in this room. But don't walk up on me, because I can fight. I can fight. But what I'm saying is that, and violence. You can see the military-industrial complex. You can see the recolonization of all of the African countries I've been to. And Professor Asher, you can probably speak to the subcontinent. But as I grapple with that, and I come to some realizations, and that's why in recent years I have been shifting toward what spaces that Professor Asher has been talking about, that I'm talking about, can we identify, you personally, what spaces can you identify in whatever kind of work you do that might, yeah, lend some resistance, but that represents indigeneity, that represents a middle ground, border thinking, and these kind of spaces that we can begin to live with the consequences of these systems of oppression.
When when Dr. Chuan collected cards from everybody and filtered some questions to share with us, acknowledging that all were good questions. Right, I mean, it's hard, it's a tough job to do, really. So one of the questions was to do with teacher ed and decentering whiteness. One was to do with early childhood, right, and making changes in a classroom with young kids. And one was to do with radical imagination and practice. And so by way of wrap up, what's floating through my head right now is a little story, and some of you have heard it. There's a song, and like those other YouTube videos, it's available even on YouTube, Strange Fruit. People think Billie Holiday, many people think she wrote it. The person who wrote it, Abel Meeropol, was a white Jewish Bronx, New York high school teacher from the Bronx, New York. And to my knowledge, he'd never been to the southern United States. And he writes this gut-wrenching song about lynchings. He was also a communist, right? And in the film Strange Fruit, which we watch in my PGE class, Post-Colonialism, Globalization, Education class, they are interviewing Meeropol's sons. The sons were actually adopted, and they were children of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. They were the sons of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. So once again, learning histories, recognizing how incomplete, and very humbly I say it, my own knowledge of history remains. So continuing to learn histories, continuing to learn to see that this kind of work, people have been doing it. It's just never enough. And I agree with you, Dr. Khalifa. I don't think capitalism, white supremacy is getting ready to roll up its mat and walk out the door. No. So all the more reason to continue to do this work. But then Kelly Oliver, Colonization of Psychic Space, has written about how there are large-scale movements, and then there are also revolts in the everyday lives of individuals. So rock those revolts. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, thank you again for joining us today. I hope that the debate will continue beyond the events. It is 5:30. The last thing I just want to say is that it's probably like some kind of breach of etiquette for the moderator to weigh in and to share who he thinks won the debate. What the hell, No, I think the winner is all of us here today. So thank you, and head fake.